Today's guest is someone whose work has profoundly shaped how the world understands trauma, healing, and human behavior. Dr. Gabor Maté is a world renowned physician, speaker, and best selling author whose insights continue to transform the fields of psychology, medicine, and personal growth. Dr. Maté is known for his belief in the biopsychosocial model of pathology, that illness and suffering cannot be separated from the biological, psychological, and social environments in which we live. He emphasizes the profound role that psychological trauma and toxic stress play in shaping our health. Central to his work is the understanding that relationships and social attachment are fundamental for learning, development, and emotional well-being. In this enlightening conversation, we explore the complexities of trauma and healing, and we dive into one of my favorite quotes of his. Trauma is not what happened to you. Trauma is what happens inside of you as a result of what happens to you. He explains that trauma is not just the events that occur that we endure, but the internal wounds that then result. And he walks us through the process of reconnecting with oneself as a vital part of recovery. We also dive into his method of compassionate inquiry, a therapeutic approach that encourages curiosity over judgment and then helps individuals uncover the deeper truths beneath their patterns, pain, and protective behaviors. Our conversation highlights that healing is possible at any stage of life and that reclaiming our authentic selves and dropping shame is central to resilience and growth. Dr. Maté's wisdom is as grounded as it is transformative, and we are profoundly honored to welcome him to Smart Talks.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Smart Talks. I am so excited to have Dr. Gabor Maté with us today. He is world renowned in his field. He's an expert in trauma. Just so excited to have him here. So looking forward actually to meeting him for such a long time. I feel like I have heard about him and his work for years and years and years. So it is truly a pleasure to meet you now.
I know that we were meant to meet in Oxford a few weeks ago, but I couldn't make it because my granddaughter was being born, so I had to be here in New York rather than Oxford. So I'm glad to meet you.
That's probably more important.
Yeah.
It was, yeah.
Well, congratulations on your growing family and welcome to our podcast. And thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Yeah. So just diving right in, many of our listeners, they've experienced trauma, whether it's abuse, neglect, or, like in my case, abduction. How do you feel like those early experiences shape the adult we become, the person we become?
Yeah. Well, it's not how I feel, it's what the science shows. So trauma affects people. Let's define trauma first of all. And you said something in a public talk that I saw, where you said that it's not what happens to you, it's what you make it mean and what decisions you make afterwards. That's what matters. And so trauma is not what happens to you. Trauma is what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. So trauma means wound. Literally, the meaning of the word trauma means a wound. It's a Greek word. So, for example, if I received a blow on the head, that's not the trauma. That's the traumatic event. The trauma is if I develop a concussion. So trauma then is the wound. Now, wounds can be physical, obviously, or they can be emotional, psychological. As a matter of fact, given the unity of mind and body, you can't even distinguish between the two properly. So trauma is an unhealed wound. So early traumas can shape a child's view of themselves. So a lot of people who were traumatized, abused, for example, will be ashamed of themselves because the child interprets things as being their own fault, even though they were simply the victims of somebody else. But shouldn't take everything personally, so that if these things, bad things happen to me, then I must be a bad person. So there's a trauma that instills very often a shame-based view of oneself. Trauma shapes one's view of the world, so that the world becomes dangerous, and one is always on the alert for bad things to happen. Or on the other hand, trauma, one way to cope with it is deep denial, in which case we tell ourselves that everything is okay and we don't see what's actually threatening us. So it can work both ways. trauma makes it difficult to be in the present moment. So in my marriage, for example, my wife will say something and I'll react, but I won't react as an adult in the present moment. I'll react like a hurt child, which means that some deep memory has been triggered for me, but I'm not realizing that it's a memory. I think it's in the present.
Mm.
So trauma makes it difficult to be in the present moment because we're always reliving the past without realizing it. Trauma can make it difficult for people to have what we call, let me put it this way, to have response flexibility. Now, when something happens, somebody says something or an event occurs, there's many different ways we can respond. But for that, and the American psychologist Rollo May said that there's the stimulus and the response, and in between there's a gap, and in that gap is our freedom to choose the most appropriate response. Trauma diminishes that gap so that something happens and we get triggered, and so that we have no response flexibility. So my wife will say something perfectly innocent, but which my mind interprets as a rejection or abandonment, and I react like an abandoned baby, which I was. So trauma takes away response flexibility. So these wounds can have huge impacts. And then, if I may just add one more thing, we develop coping mechanisms. So let's say you weren't loved for exactly who you were. Then you'll be consumed by being liked by everybody, and you'll develop this very nice persona. So everybody will like you, try to please everybody, a people pleaser, as a way of getting the love that you didn't get. But that people pleasing and that niceness is actually means a suppression of yourself. So trauma can actually shape certain aspects of the personality. And we think that's who we are. Or let's say you didn't get the attention you needed, which is a need of the child. And you can hurt kids not just by doing bad things to them, not just through the horrific events that befell you, Elizabeth, but kids can be hurt also by just not having their needs met. So one of the needs a child has is for attention. Let's say you don't get the attention you need just for existing, then you'll be consumed by attracting attention, and you'll be desperate to be attractive all the time. So trauma shapes the personality in these ways. So there's so many ways that trauma shows up, and of course it interferes with relationships, activities, and I'll finish this little sermonette by adding that trauma has all kinds of health implications. Mental health conditions are almost always rooted in trauma. Addictions are always rooted in trauma, in my view, and I've written about that. Many physical health conditions are potentiated by early trauma, including malignancy, including autoimmune disease, and so on. Most doctors don't know that because in medical school they don't teach the scientifically demonstrated unity of mind and body, emotions and physiology. But in reality, that's how it is. So trauma's got broad implications.
So, with that statement, trauma isn't just what happens to us, but what happens inside of us that you've become kind of famous for saying and is in your book. I've heard you say, as an add on to that, that it's a good thing. It's not just what happens to us, it's a good thing that it's what's inside of us because then we have the power to change it. So, can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that that is really groundbreaking for everyone to understand.
Absolutely. So I've written and talked about my early traumas as a Jewish infant under the Nazis in Hungary in 1944. And one aspect of that was my mother handing me to a complete stranger in the street to save my life as an 11-month-old. Literally, she could not keep me alive another day. Now, that saved my life. It was an act of tremendous love and self-sacrifice on the part of a 24-year-old woman. But how does the baby interpret it? As being abandoned. Who gets abandoned? Somebody who's not important and somebody who's not lovable. Now, that's the trauma. The trauma is not that I was given to a stranger. That's a traumatic event. The trauma is that my self-belief of being unworthy. So then how do I cope with that? Well, then I become a workaholic and try to prove my value through serving others and ignoring my own needs, ignoring my own children's needs in order to be important in the world. Now, that's a good thing, Because if trauma was that I was given to a stranger, that'll never change. But if the trauma is my belief that I'm not worthy, lovable, important, well, I can heal that. That can be healed today. So that it's a good thing that trauma is not what happened to us, but what happened inside us, because then we have the capacity to heal. I mean, if trauma was what happened to you, Elizabeth, when you were age 14 to this horrendous 9 months of your life, that'll never not have happened.
Mm-hmm.
But if trauma is the impact of all that on your psyche and your functioning, well, you can heal those. So that's a good thing.
I feel like I've met a lot of survivors, and I mean, I'm just like, some survivors, they seem completely normal. They've experienced something horrendous. And then some survivors, I mean, they've experienced what they've experienced, but they almost carry it around like a badge of honor or like a crutch for the rest of their life. I mean, I just heard you say like it can be healed like that. Can trauma be healed quickly, or do people develop an addiction to being the victim? Or am I going off into crazy land?
It's unusual well, when I said like that, I was being dramatic. Trauma can be healed occasionally, quickly. Yeah, I've seen it happen almost instantaneously. Rarely, though. Usually it's a case of longer work with some setbacks and, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, that kind of thing. But it can be healed. Yes. Some people develop a victim identity. So they identify with being a victim and they have a hard time giving it up because maybe being a victim was the only way they ever got attention. So then there's something to be gained from being a victim. Now people will pay attention to me. But the other aspect of victimhood is that the victim says, I mean, what happened to them did happen. They were victimized, but that does not make them a victim. That's not who they are. They're a human being to whom bad stuff happened. When I say that I'm still a victim, you're saying that, or one is saying that what happened long ago defines who I am, and I'm helpless in the face of it. And that means I don't have responsibility for how I behave in the world.
Mhm.
Now, people have a hard time with responsibility. They confuse responsibility with blame. But responsibility just means I have the ability to respond. And let's face it, any of us who are in relationships, we'd rather not take responsibility for ourselves. We'd rather, I can be the victim of my wife in a split of a second. I'm talking in my mind. So there's a kind of payoff to that victim identity, but it also limits you. And the payoff is maybe I get the attention that I never got. And maybe also I don't have to take responsibility.
At the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, we believe everyone deserves to feel safe in their own home, especially survivors of sexual violence. That's why we've partnered with Cove Security, a company dedicated to protecting what matters most. Together, we're providing free security systems and professional monitoring to survivors who need it because safety should never be a privilege. When you choose Cove, you're not just securing your home, you're helping us create a world where safety, healing, and hope are possible for everyone. Head to covesmart.com/ESF to learn more and use code ESF, all caps, at checkout for an additional 10% off of your first order.
I love what you said there. There are so many good things in what you just said, but responsibility, breaking that down very simply, is just the ability to respond. And the fact that you said people conflate that with blame, I think that that is huge. And I think separating those two things and understanding them, again, is so powerful. And we talk about this a lot at the foundation, like Elizabeth was saying, because of our work with so many victims, that the traumatic event is something that happened to you. It doesn't have to define who you are. And we don't like the use of labels like that. So I feel like that goes along so much with what you're saying, not only about responsibility, but also about trauma as an event and the ability to change, or having the event happen, but the ability to change the trauma inside of you being your response to that event. I just think
Well,
that's so
look,
powerful.
again, literally, trauma means wound. So can wounds be healed? Yeah, wounds can be healed, and they can heal well or they can heal poorly, but that depends on the kind of help you get, circumstances that you live under, resources that you might have, the support that you receive. But yeah, if we understand that trauma literally means a wound, then it's obvious that wounds can be healed.
So what would you say? Sorry, go ahead, Elizabeth.
I was gonna say, does anyone make it to adulthood without trauma from their childhood?
Well, the theoretical answer is yes. The practical answer is that in this society, hardly anybody. And so in my book, The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture, the point I'm making is that this society, for all its achievements, attainments, accomplishments, gets some basic things really wrong. And people can be hurt, not just by bad things happening to them, but by the good things not happening that should have. And this society is very poor at meeting people's children's needs. So very few people in this culture, for no fault of their parents, but very few people in this culture escape without some wounding that hasn't healed yet. Very few. There are some, very few. This society is not designed to protect people from wounding or to help them heal when they are wounded. In fact, in so many ways, it undermines human health. So the practical answer is very few.
I think that was one of sorry, we keep doing this. Sorry. We're just jumping in because we're so excited. Sorry, go ahead, Elizabeth.
Well, I was gonna say, what about for those children, I mean, like yourself, that experienced something when they were so young, and they experience wounding, pain, trauma, but it was so young that as an adult they don't remember. How do you help them work through that or even identify what it was that they experienced?
Right. One thing I didn't say, by the way, about the impacts of trauma is it literally affects how your brain develops. So the human brain develops in interaction with the environment. It's the actions of the environment on the genes that determine the circuitry of the human brain. I'm just giving you up-to-date brain science so that I missed that part. So actually it affects the brain itself, which brings me back to your question. You say we can't remember those early woundings. That's not accurate. We can't recall them, but we remember them. And there's a distinction we have to make here. There's two kinds of memory. There's what we call explicit memory, which is recall memory. That's you can call something back. So you can recall what you did last night. You can recall what a teacher said to you in grade 4. That's called explicit memory. The part of the brain that encodes explicit recall memory is called the hippocampus, and it comes online around age 3. So very few people have any recollection before age 3. Some do, very few. And most people don't have recollections much before age 4 or 5. That's explicit memory. So you're quite right. I don't recall being given to a stranger by my mother in the streets of Budapest. I don't recall that. I can't possibly. But I remember it because there's another kind of memory called implicit memory, which doesn't have the episodic details of events, but it has the emotional imprint encoded in the brain. And implicit memory begins even before birth. So when I experience, in the Myth of Normal, in the first chapter, I talk about how I arrive at the airport at the young and tender age of 73 in Vancouver 8 years ago now. And my wife's supposed to pick me up at the airport, and she sends a text saying, I haven't left home yet. Should I still come? And I go into a rage. And I go home and I take a taxi home, 15 minutes, big deal. And she's an artist. And I know what happened. When artists are in their studio, they forget they're married. They forget everything. They're just painting. So I've only known this for 50 years. But my rage and my distancing or that's the implicit imprint.
And triggered by your abandonment, right?
Exactly right. So that's what a trigger actually is. A trigger is always a memory. Once you understand that, you can start looking at it. So that sense of abandonment and then my withdrawal, that's what young children do, by the way. When they're separated from the mother and they're reunited after a long period of time, they won't even look at the mom. They'll withdraw. It's a protection of the brain. It says you were so hurt when you were abandoned that you won't make yourself so vulnerable again. And that then shows up in your relationship with your spouse. So, yes, there's no recollection, but yes, there's memory, which shows up in your reactions. And with a little bit of help, it's very easy to understand that.
Do you need to, I mean, like, does a person need to know exactly what they experienced for them to heal what happened, to heal their trauma? Or can
No.
you go about healing without knowing precisely what it was that happened?
You can heal without knowing precisely what happened by dealing with the physiological and emotional states that arise in the present. So when somebody has these reactions, I wasn't there, I don't know what happened to them, and they may not recall what happened to them. But we know that those emotions and those physiological states are genuine and they are an accurate response, a normal response to some abnormal circumstance. So the healing is in the present with the emotions that arise and the physiological states that fuel them. And that can happen in the present. You don't need to have the precise details because it's the emotional details and the impact that's important, not the physical details.
So even if you don't have, oh, I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. It helps if you can. So I'll tell you an example. A woman that I know, quite well-known woman in Hollywood, who was sexually abused by her grandfather. And she's written a book about it. Offline, I can even tell you. You might want to talk to her because she's a wonderful interviewee, a leading stunt woman in Hollywood. She got in touch with the details of what happened to her under the influence of psychedelic therapy. And she discovered some really, horrendous things. So sometimes you can get there through psychedelic treatment or hypnosis, or you know what? I just ran into a guy this morning here in Brooklyn. I was having coffee and he comes up and he recognizes me and he says, "Oh, thank you for your work." And he was sexually abused from age 8 to 14, age 6 to 14. And new memories are coming up for him, which means that he's actually healing. It means that his organism is saying, you're strong enough now to handle these memories. So over time, very often the actual details will emerge. But again, what's important is to deal with the emotions and the body. That's what's important.
So to summarize, even if you do not have the explicit memory, meaning like the recall, all of the details of this event that happened to you, but if you're an adult that's struggling with triggers that may be trauma responses, you can still be treated for trauma. You can still go through therapy because
Absolutely.
what we're treating is the response and the emotions now, today.
Exactly. And
Okay.
so I say to people who come to me that, they get triggered. And by the way, trigger is an interesting word. When we talk about people being triggered, how big a part of the weapon is the trigger?
Small.
A trigger only works because there's ammunition and explosive material there. So we can keep talking about the triggers, or we can say, what's the explosive material that I'm carrying inside? Far more interesting question. But now when people come to me, I'll say to them, so you got these reactions, you get upset, you get enraged, you get hurt, you perceive yourself as being abandoned, we can make two assumptions. We can assume you're crazy or you're not crazy. What do you want to assume? Well, most people say, I'd rather assume that I'm not crazy. I say, great, because I don't think you are either. But that means that those reactions have a reason for being there. And something happened. We may not know exactly what happened in detail, but something happened to have encoded those reactions in your body. So there's nothing wrong with you. What you're actually experiencing is a normal response to abnormal circumstances. So let's deal with the responses in the present because you're not crazy.
And truly, that's like those responses are really a protection and like a self-preservation technique, right? That our brains and bodies kind of have within us. So would you agree with that statement to some degree?
To a large degree.
Okay.
There's an article from Harvard University published in the Journal of Pediatrics, which is the official journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics, in 2012, February. And the article said that social and physical environments that produce stress or instability will evoke adaptations, physiological and psychological, that are necessary for immediate survival, but which may come at a significant cost to long-term health, survival, and longevity. In other words, so one of the examples I often give is attention deficit disorder, with which I was diagnosed in my 50s. And, the medical profession, its usual neurobiological bias says it's a genetic disease that you're inherited. No, two of my kids were diagnosed shortly after. So it's genetic, runs in families. Oh, it's an adaptation. The tuning out, the absent-mindedness. If I were to stress either of you right now, Heather or Elizabeth, be aggressive or rude or somehow threatening, what would be your options? Tell me what your options would be. We're not even in the same room, so what would be your options?
I mean, hang up and
Exactly.
the call.
Exactly. That's called flight, right? The other thing you could do would be to fight back and say,
Yeah.
"You can't talk to me that way." Yeah, who the heck are you to talk to me that way? That's called fight. Or there's two of you here, and you could turn to each other for help. But what if you're being stressed and you can't escape and you can't fight back and there's no help, such as my case as an infant with a stressed mother? Now, when the mother is stressed, as my mom was, the baby is stressed. Could I have escaped, change the situation, fight back, ask for help? Who? What do? I tune out. But when do I tune out? So it's an adaptation, just as Heather you say. But when do I tune out? When my brain is developing. So then the tuning out gets wired into my brain. So a lot of these adult health conditions began as early adaptations.
And
Which
are
then,
these,
sorry,
I was just gonna say, are these like health adaptations? Are they healable?
absolutely. So let's say I mentioned people who are people pleasers. Children have a need to be accepted, to be loved. In fact, that need has been wired into us, either by God, if you're purely religious, or by evolution, or a combination of both. But that need to be accepted, to be loved, is just an absolute need of the human child. Now, what if you get the message at age 2 and you throw a tantrum, which is what 2-year-olds do, by the way, because a 2-year-old can't tell the difference between what they want and what they need. Neither do many adults, by the way, but developmentally, 2-year-olds can't. So they get upset. And then the parents say, time out, you can't be with us. Good kids don't get angry. Well, the message that especially good little girls don't get angry. Especially now, the message the child gets is not that good little girls don't get angry, but that angry little girls don't get loved. Since you have the need to be loved, you will push down, repress the anger. You will push it down. What's another word for pushing something down, by the way? When you're driving and you have to push down the pedal, what's the word for that?
Break.
Depression.
Stop.
Depressing it. You're depressing it. This disease of depression begins with people having to push down their feelings in order to be accepted. And then, in order to get loved, the person becomes a people pleaser. If I'm nice enough, maybe they'll love me. But that people pleasing means you've taken a lot of stress because you're always looking after everybody else's needs and ignoring your own. And you're never saying no. So one of my books, when the body says no, if you don't say no, your body will say it in the form of illness. And I could go into the physiology of that. But the point is that I'm not sure what the point is anymore, except I've forgotten what question I'm at. This is my ADD. I don't know what question I'm answering. What question am I answering?
Thank you for listening to Smart Talks. This is a quick break to say thank you to one of our sponsors. This season of Smart Talks with the Elizabeth Smart Foundation is sponsored by Minky Couture Blankets. At the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, we know the power of comfort and safety, and that's exactly what Minky brings into every home. Their blankets are luxurious, so soft, beautifully made, and designed to wrap you in warmth because everyone deserves to feel secure. We're so grateful for Minky's support in our mission to end sexual violence and to empower survivors. Treat yourself or someone you love to the comfort of Minky and join us in supporting a safer world. Use code ESF, all caps, for 50% off your order today.
Is ADD curable?
Like treatable and yeah.
Curable. Well, you can accuse me of boasting, but I wrote that book 26 years ago, Scattered Minds. This month, it was on the New York Times bestsellers list. And that's because a lot of people get so much help from it. And it's not so much that it's totally curable. Like, I'll never be without ADD. I have certain traits that are never going to go away. Like, I lose things. I can literally lose something sitting in a chair. That's its special talent. I challenge you to do something sitting there, but I can do it. It's amazing. So when I travel, I'm always going to lose a toothbrush or misplace my computer or something's going to happen. So what? That's the cost of living. So what? So I'm a flawed human being. But I'll tell you something. The first book I wrote, Scattered Minds and ADHD, I took medication to help me focus. It really helped me. My most recent book, which came out 3 years ago now, The Myth of Normal, was a much more longer book, much more complex, took much more research, took me 10 years, 20,000 articles, hundreds of books, interviews, no medication at all. Which means that once I figured out how my mind functions, I could actually regulate my mind's functioning. So significantly, all these mental health conditions can be healed. Now, does it? I was talking last week with a woman called Laura Delano, and Laura has written a book called Unshrunk. That's another person you might want to talk to.
Yeah.
And she comes from the Franklin Delano family, very upper class Massachusetts clan. And she was diagnosed at age 12 with bipolar disorder, which itself was a misdiagnosis. And for 15 years, she was on all these psychiatric medications. Now, she's 42 now, Elizabeth. I think she's close to your age. She's got children. She's got a 2-year-old toddler and married and so on. At age 27, she got herself off the medication. Now, is she totally symptom-free? No, she's not. But is she okay? Yes, she is. In other words, a lot of the healing is getting into a different relationship with yourself. And she's done that. So do the symptoms, all the symptoms totally go away? No. Can you be healed? Can you function? Can you be satisfied? Can you be in a good relationship? Can you do useful work? Can you find joy in life? Yes.
That's a great message. So basically, it's never too late to heal from trauma. Even if you don't remember all of the things that happened, even if you don't remember the details, even if you don't know why your responses are the way that they are, it's never too late to heal. And like you said, to change your relationship with yourself and your coping, and probably then by extension, your relationship with others and just your connection to the outside world then too.
Absolutely. No, often people need help, but it's not as complicated as all that. And what I didn't say is that the biggest impact of trauma is disconnection from yourself, but that connection can always be regained. See, let's take something like addictions. Again, the medical profession, my profession, says it's an inherited brain disease. No, it isn't. I'm not going to go into the genetics of it, but I just firmly state on pure scientific grounds that it's not a genetic disease. When people get addictions, what word do we use? What have they done? What's the word?
Recovery?
Exactly. Now, what does it mean to recover something?
To get back?
To find, yeah.
Exactly, to get it back, to find it again. When you talk to people who have recovered and you say, what did you find again? They say, I found myself, which means that that true self, that nature-given or God-given self has never been destroyed. You've lost sight of it, you became disconnected from it, but it can always be recovered as long as there's consciousness. So that's available to everybody.
I love that. So what would you say, in your opinion, which I know there's probably not a simple answer to this, right? But what would be the first step in someone healing from their trauma? Is it just recognition of these responses? Like if they can't remember the trauma, let's say, is it just recognition of these responses or of these like kind of negative ways of coping?
Well, usually what happens is a Greek playwright, Aeschylus, who in his play Agamemnon says that the way the gods created us, we have to suffer into truth. Suffer into truth. Now, usually what happens, as in my case, I was in my 40s, I had 3 kids, I was a successful physician in demand, or remunerate, and depressed and unhappy. And at some point, I had to ask myself, well, what's going on here? So usually the healing becomes with some recognition that it's not right and maybe it doesn't have to be this way. And so for people that can happen in a number of ways, a relationship breakup that might make them start questioning, why was I with that person who wasn't right for me? Or why couldn't I find the love that I'm really looking for? Or an illness. If you look at, say, Sheryl Crow, the singer, she had breast cancer. And I quote her in The Myth of Normal. And I don't have the book in front of me now, but I'm paraphrasing her. She said that before my breast cancer, I pleased everybody. I was always trying to make everybody like me and love me. And I ignored my true self. And I always had voices in my head telling me that whatever I did was wrong. And since the breast cancer, I put myself first, my own needs, and I've silenced those voices. So sometimes it's a physical illness that wakes you up. Sometimes it's a mental health crisis. Sometimes it's repetitive failure. And sometimes it's success, because this is a very materialistic society. And it keeps telling you that if you attain and acquire and achieve and accomplish, then you'll be happy. And then you're successful. You attain, you accomplish, you acquire, you achieve, and you're unhappy. And you say, well, what's going on here? So usually the first step to answer your question is something happens that wakes you up that says, this is not the way I'm meant to be. And then you start looking for the answer. And the Buddha, 2,600 years ago, was a great psychologist. And he said that once you realize that you're on the wrong path, that's the beginning of finding the right path. He said something to that nature.
Love that.
So, how do you differentiate between a want and a need? I mean, like taking Sheryl Crow, what she said, for example, I put my own needs first instead of trying to please other people. I guess my question is, like, how do you know what your boundary is? What you actually need as a person versus, well, I don't want to do that, so that's my boundary. How do you differentiate between the two? Am I being clear?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, it's a very difficult dilemma for a lot of people, because we live in a culture where the economy is significantly based on selling people stuff they don't need, but they make them want it so much that they confuse the want with the need. So you need a new car, or you need this particular line of clothing, or you need this latest gadget. And it's almost addictive. And I've had my own addictive behaviors. And really, an addiction is a confusion between what you need and what you want. So how do you make that distinction? Well, the body is a really good guide. So I have a little exercise that I teach people. It's in The Myth of Normal, but I teach it in my seminars. I can run through it very quickly with people. So I ask people this question: tell me where in your life do you have trouble saying no? I mean, where there's a no that wants to be said, but you're not saying it. And that usually shows up in 2 areas: work and relationships. Now, women particularly have a hard time saying no because they're programmed not to say no. They're supposed to meet everybody's needs.
Yeah.
It's not surprising to me that 80% of autoimmune disease happens to women, because autoimmune disease happens to people that have trouble saying no. They take on too much stress, and that stress undermines their physiology. So the first question is, where do you have trouble saying no? If your friends want your support, but you're tired and you played out and you got your own kids to look after, you've been up all night. Can you say no? So that's the first question. Second question is, what is the impact of not saying no? Well, the impact is fatigue, depression, poor sleep, dry mouth, resentment, frequent colds, whatever. In other words, let your body teach you. Then the third question is, what is the hidden story? What is the belief behind your difficulty saying, if I say no, I'm selfish? If I say no, they won't love me. If I say no, I'm not worthy. Is that really true? Number 4, where did you learn these stories? Well, I guess where you learned it. You learned it in childhood. In other words, you pay close attention to yourself. Finally, Elizabeth, to answer your question, check in with your body. Because when you say no, when you don't say no, what does it feel like? Now, look, your 2-year-old child wakes up at night with a fever. You're not going to say no. Doesn't matter how tired you are or whatever. You'll be up all night and you'll be doing whatever needs to be done. So there's situations in life where maybe you don't feel like it, but it's not even an issue. I'm talking about people who chronically don't say no and compulsively don't say no. Ask them to check in with their bodies. What does it feel like? It feels terrible. So let their body teach you. And when you say no in a positive sense, which is, and by the way, all no is a boundary defense. It just says, I'm going to maintain my integrity, my wholeness. Check in with that. What does that feel like? So let your body teach you. Is that clear?
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, I think that would probably, well, I can say that definitely would help me. I think that would probably help everyone to keep that in mind.
Today's episode is brought to you by Bitch Sticks, a brand that puts its money where its mouth is. They create lip balms, skincare, and self-care essentials that actually do good, funding programs that provide meaningful support for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. At the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, we believe in turning advocacy into action. That's why we're so excited to partner with Bitch Sticks. Together, we're transforming something that once carried pain into a symbol of strength and healing, helping survivors rediscover their worth and reclaim their voices. If you want to support a mission that matters, head to bitchsticks.com and use code SMART20 for 20% off your order. That's bitchsticks, bitchstix.com, and enter code SMART20 for 20% off your order.
Well, I've been told by many people that little exercise changed their lives.
Yeah, I can see why. And I think it's related back, like asking those questions, letting your body differentiate the difference between a want and a need.
Yeah.
And just being present in that, being present.
So, you know what? And I didn't answer that part of it. With the want, which is not a need, like when you say, I need to have a glass of water, there's no tension around that. I need a glass of water. I'm thirsty. So there's a kind of it's a need, but there's no sense of emotional urgency around it. There's a kind of calm acknowledgement. With a want that you don't need, there's all kinds of tension. Like when you think about getting the next iPhone, you don't need it, you just want it. So there's a kind of a tension that's worth paying attention to with the want. That's not there with a need. A need is very assertive, it's very straightforward. A want is rather convoluted and tension driven.
Okay, my next question, I want to kind of talk about two different things that you talk about. So in your book, Myth of Normal, you talk about how we've kind of normalized suffering. And then you also talk about compassionate inquiry. And so how do you think, can you talk about compassionate inquiry and the idea that it can help people access the root of their suffering specifically?
Sure. It's not so much that we've normalized suffering, but what we've done is, well, yeah, we have. Actually, you know what? You're right. So we've normalized all kinds of behaviors that create suffering. So, for example, when the European Christians first came to North America, They were appalled by how the natives raised their children. Do you know why? Because the natives didn't beat their kids. Indigenous tribes, when you study them internationally, they don't hit their kids. To the Europeans, that was abnormal. And they actually said that, you have to chastise the child, spare the rods, all this kind of stuff. So they normalized something that's totally abnormal. That's a source of suffering. We know now from modern studies that spanking of kids, this is by the American Pediatric Association, spanking of kids can be as traumatic as more severe forms of abuse. But for a long time, that was normalized. And in many homes, they still think it's normal to hit a child. So we've normalized, that's just one example. We've normalized kids' separation from their mothers. In the United States, 25% of women have to go back to work within 2 weeks of giving birth.
Yes.
That means a massive abandonment of children. The results are tremendous in terms of mental health problems, behavior problems, health problems. But we've normalized it because we confused what we do with what is normal. But normal in its proper sense means healthy and natural. So there's a normal body temperature within range within which we thrive, outside of which we are ill. Blood pressure, normal, healthy, natural. But there's a lot of behaviors that we consider normal because we do them all, but they're totally abnormal from the point of view of health and nature. And repeat your question again, because that was part of the answer.
No, yeah, that was great. It was also how compassionate inquiry plays in with that. Yeah.
All right. So let me ask either of you this. Have you ever said to yourself, why did I do this?
Yeah, all the time.
No. If I came to you and said, why did you do that? What would your impulse be?
Either I think kind of like the same, like come back at you, or kind of withdraw to myself.
Exactly. Some kind of defensive response. But what if I used almost the same words in a different tone? And I said, I'm curious why you did that. Are you interested in looking at why you did that? So why did I do this is an assault. It's a judgment. It's a diminishment of the self. I wonder why I did that. That's a compassionate question. So there's a spiritual teacher that I know who says that only when compassion is present will people allow themselves to see the truth. So people need compassion in order to open up, in order not to feel threatened. So compassion inquiry is both like a general principle. It's also a method of therapy that I've developed that we teach to a lot of therapists online internationally. And there's some programs to the lay public as well that's available. I'm not going to advertise it except to mention it. People can look it up. But the essence of it is that the truth is inside everybody, and that connection with the self is inside everybody, and approach compassionately, people will find the truth. Now, what did Jesus say about the truth? He said, you will know the truth and the truth will liberate you. He didn't say the truth will liberate you. He said, you will know the truth and it will liberate you. But only in the presence of compassion will people allow themselves to see the truth. So that's the essence of compassionate inquiry, is rather than judging yourself. I mean, people are so hard on themselves. I mentioned before how trauma instills a shame-based view of yourself. So I've had my addictive behaviors I worked with North America's most severely addicted population in Vancouver, British Columbia for 12 years. There's quite a difference between recognizing we've been looking at addiction as a bad choice, as a moral failure, as an ethical weakness, as a weakness of will, as opposed to, well, let's try it. I'm just going to give you an example of it. I'll give you a definition of an addiction. An addiction is manifested in any behavior in which a person finds pleasure temporarily or relief and therefore craves, but then suffers negative consequences as a result of and doesn't give up. So craving pleasure, relief in the short term, harm in the long term, inability or refusal to desist in the long term. That's what an addiction is. I didn't mention anything about drugs. It could be substances, legal, like alcohol or nicotine, or it could be substances illegal, like heroin and cocaine and crystal meth. Or it could be food, eating, shopping, extreme sports, cell phones, gaming, gambling, work. So let me just try a bit of an experiment here. I'm not asking for any details, and maybe the answer is no, and that's fine. But if I ask the two of you, according to that definition, did you ever have, I'm not going to ask what, by the way, but according to that definition, have you ever had any addictive pattern in your life? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, well, let me ask you this then. I'm not going to ask you what it was. I'm going to ask you, what was good about it? What did it do for you in the short term that you wanted?
I mean, it usually gave me like that, I guess, endorphin high.
Well, that's an analysis. So give you pleasure, reward.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
Made me
great.
feel better.
Sense of elation, very good. And Heather, yourself, what did it give you?
Help me achieve something that I wanted to achieve.
So it made you more functional?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Is having reward, pleasure, elation, functionality, are they in themselves good things or bad things?
Say good things.
Good. Yeah.
Absolutely. In other words, the addiction wasn't your primary problem. It was your attempt to solve a problem. In your case, Heather, lack of motivation and functionality. In your case, Elizabeth, the lack of the natural joy of life. In other words, the addiction was an attempt to solve a problem, which then caused more problems by definition. But it didn't start off as a disease. It started off now lacking motivation, vitality, functionality, lacking joy, or states of emotional suffering. And so my mantra under addiction is don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain. And so the question then is, why were you lacking those qualities? That's where the trauma comes in. So if we approach addictions with moral judgment and admonishments and punishments and shaming, what are the odds of that person recovering their true selves? But if we said, you know what, this behavior, it's not helping you, but they had a good reason for going that way. Let's not blame you. Let's find out what those reasons were. What happened to you? That's an example of compassionate inquiry.
Yeah. It's amazing.
I feel like this has been such a fascinating conversation. I feel like you given me so much to think about just about in my own life. And I also feel like you've given a lot of hope. It's never too late to start healing. But if you had one message to give the world, what would that be?
In The Myth of Normal, we quote this film with Matt Damon and Robin Williams called Good Will Hunting. And Matt Damon plays this dysfunctional, mentally disturbed individual, and Robin Williams is this compassionate psychologist who at some point grabs Matt Damon and says, "It's not your fault. So drop the shame and get curious." That would be my message. And this is true both on the individual level and on the social level, because scientifically and humanely and spiritually or in any sense, you can't separate the individual from the environment. You can't separate the mind from the body, the emotions from the physiology, and the emotions from our social relationships, and our social relationships from our culture. So that if we just stop blaming and got curious, that would be my message.
I think that's such a great summary of your work overall. Like, drop the shame, get curious. But I would also add, and be compassionate, because in that scene that you're talking about, not only does he shake him and say, it's not your fault, but he also embraces him and hugs him and responds with compassion to the situation. And that's something Matt Damon's character had never really experienced before. And so I think that's such a great summary of your work overall. And like Elizabeth, you said, thinking of it that way just gives me so much hope for all of us. So thank you for sharing that. And thank you for all of your wisdom today.
Yes.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to speak with you both. Thank you.
I so look forward to hopefully meeting you one day and continuing to learn of your work.
That's it for today's episode of Smart Talks, brought to you by the Elizabeth Smart Foundation. Thanks for joining us as we dive into these important conversations about creating a safer, more compassionate world. We hope that what you've heard challenges you to think deeply, feel more compassionately, and see the world through the powerful lens of a survivor's truth. If today's episode resonated with you, or if you know someone who would benefit from hearing this, please share it with them and consider subscribing. And leave us a review wherever you're listening. We'd love to hear from you. Connect with us on social media. You'll find us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. If you would like to support, you can make a one-time or recurring donation of any amount at elizabethsmartfoundation.org/donate. You can also find more resources and ways to get involved on our website. Thank you for listening and being a part of a community that listens, believes, and works together to create a future where no one has to suffer in silence.